Merci Denis et Eva. Je suis très content d'être avec eux, avec tous. Et je suis désolé que mon français n'est pas assez bon à faire la présentation en français. Donc, je vais parler anglais. It is truly a great honor to be given the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I think as general medical practitioners, we carry a great responsibility, not only to take care of the sick, but also to think about how we safeguard human health into the future. And while we've made great strides in the past 60 years, we are now seeing deeply concerning trends that threaten all the progress we've made so far. We find ourselves gathered together here today at what I think is truly a unique moment in human history. By most metrics, there's never been a better time to be a human being. We've seen extraordinary improvements in most metrics of human development over the last 60 or 70 years. 70 years ago, 42% of the adult population could read and write. That number has now doubled. In that same period, the percentage of people living in extreme poverty has dropped from 62% to 10%. Life expectancy has risen from 46 years to 72 years, and child mortality has fallen by more than a factor of 4. But the same extraordinary developments in science and technology that have fueled these almost unimaginable improvements in human development in one person's lifetime have also been driving an extraordinary expansion in humanity's global ecological footprint. We live now in a period that some call the Great Acceleration in the impact that we are having on our planet's natural systems. Whether we look at appropriation of fresh water or proliferation of cars and trucks or production and use of synthetic fertilizers, paper production, plastic production, energy use, the curves all look relatively similar, with fairly modest consumption up until about 1950, and then this steep, almost exponential rise in our consumption patterns globally. And not surprisingly, when we look at our impact across our planet's natural systems, we see very similar trends, whether we're looking at loss of biodiversity, exploitation of fisheries, addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, ocean acidification, or the loss of tropical and temperate forests. And the reason that all of these graphs look so similar is that they're all underlain by two more fundamental trends. The growth in human population, the number of people who share this planet with us has been growing, but was relatively stable for a very long part of human history. And then starting at around 1900, it started to climb up to around 2 billion people in 1950. And then again, this very steep rise in human population. At the same time that was happening, per capita GDP, the amount of goods and services that each one of us is asking our planet to provide for us, has been rising even more steeply by a factor of 11. And when we multiply human population growth with per capita GDP growth, we get this extraordinary rise in total world GDP. So we sit now at the top of this sort of almost vertical curve, which is this explosion in what humanity is asking the planet to provide for us. It's hard now to overstate the extent to which we are the dominant force shaping our planet's biophysical conditions. In order to feed ourselves every year, we use 40% of the Earth's land surface for croplands and pasture. We use half the accessible fresh water on the planet, mostly to irrigate our crops. We're fishing 90% of monitored fisheries at or well beyond maximum sustainable limits. We've cut down around half the tropical and temperate forests on the planet. We've dammed over 60% of its rivers, and that number is rising to about 90% over the next few decades. And we're suffering from a growing problem of air, water, and soil pollution. As you all know, we're also disrupting the global climate system. And all of these human-caused changes to our planet's natural systems are starting to unweave the entire fabric of life. We're driving species extinct at 1,000 times their baseline rates. Population sizes of birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians has fallen by 2/3 since 1970. Around 1 million species face extinction, many within the next few decades. The core premise of planetary health is that the size of our collective ecological footprint now exceeds our planet's capacities to absorb our wastes or to provide the resources that we're using sustainably. And as a result, our activities are now transforming not only the climate system, but driving the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth, changing land use and land cover, altering biogeochemical cycles, and driving scarcity of resources like fresh water and arable land. And each one of these human-caused, global-scale environmental changes is interacting with the others in complex ways that we're just beginning to understand to affect the foundational conditions for human health. The quality of air we breathe, the quality and quantity of food that we can produce, our exposure to infectious diseases and extreme weather events, even the habitability of some of the places that we live. And as a result, we're seeing growing burdens of disease across every dimension of health. And it's why I said at the beginning, we're worrying that the progress we've made over the last 60 years is beginning to be eroded by our own impacts on our natural life support systems. Just as we have come to understand over the last 2 or 3 decades that there are important social and cultural and political determinants of human health, we're now coming to understand that there are critical ecological determinants, that indeed our health is nested in a set of biophysical conditions, and that we are now changing those biophysical conditions at the fastest rate in the history of our species. So how does this end up affecting our own health? And I want to give you a few concrete examples. I'm going to start with some of my own research. So this was research that was spurred on by some preliminary experiments, many done here in Europe, in which people were growing crops at elevated carbon dioxide levels in greenhouses and chambers. And they were finding that the nutrient content of those crops was changing as a result of higher levels of CO2. But they were small experiments, and they were done in sort of artificial growing conditions, and so it wasn't clear how real these effects really were. And so working with a group of agronomists all around the world, we ended up growing 41 cultivars of 6 staple food crops on 7 locations across 3 continents over 10 years to build a large data set to find out, is it really true that rising carbon dioxide levels are affecting the nutritional value of the food that we eat? And in fact, what we found was that there were very significant reductions in nutrients that are very important for human health, like iron and zinc and protein, resulting from levels of CO2 that we expect to see by about the middle of this century. We spent the next several years modeling how these changes in the nutrient content of our food would affect the health of populations around the world. And we looked at the populations of 152 countries. And what we found was that the CO2 effect alone would be likely to push 150 to 200 million people into a new risk of micronutrient deficiency, in addition to exacerbating deficiencies in around 1 billion people who lived in that state already. Another area that we've been working is in pollination and the fact that pollinating insects are declining. We know that biodiversity is declining. Many of you have heard of the insect apocalypse. We know that insect populations are falling. But what we didn't know is how that related to human health. And in a paper that we actually just published in December, we were able to show first what we knew, which was that fruits and vegetables and nuts are very important for human health in protecting us from diseases like heart disease, strokes, certain cancers, and diabetes. Our pollinator ecologist colleagues had shown on experimental farms around the world that insufficient pollinators, not having enough wild pollinators, was reducing the production of those foods by about 3 to 5%. And when we modeled if those foods had been produced, how would they move through the global food trade system, and who would ultimately have purchased those foods and consumed them? And then what would the health benefits of consuming those pollinator-dependent foods have been? We found that we're seeing about 500,000 deaths every year today because we don't have enough pollinating insects to optimize the production of those foods. We also found that in lower and middle income countries, around 12 to 30% of the agricultural GDP of those countries was being lost because of insufficient pollination, which is a huge part of the economy of many lower income countries. So very significant health effects and very significant economic effects. And then finally, we've been looking at what it means that our oceans are warming and how that will affect nutritional outcomes. And we know from fisheries ecologists that warming oceans, meaning that fish sizes are getting smaller, that the size of the fisheries themselves is getting smaller, and that fisheries, most importantly, are moving away from the tropics and out toward the poles, disconnecting the fish from the people who most depend on them. And we wanted to know how many people in the world are getting really important amounts of critical nutrients from wild harvested fish and will be threatened by not having that access in the future. And what we found was that over 1 billion people fell into that category of being close to sufficiency and getting large percentages of their intake from wild harvested fish. So roughly 1 billion people are depending on wild harvested fish to have adequate intake of omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin B12, iron and zinc, and other important nutrients. So these are just a few little examples from my own research of how food systems and nutrition are being affected by biophysical change. And of course, there are many other examples where I don't do research, how water scarcity is affecting our ability to produce enough food, how degradation of arable land, which is ongoing around the world, is affecting food production. Population displacement leads to malnutrition in many instances, and as I will say later, population displacement has been rising steadily. Pollution is another problem, particularly ground-level ozone, which is a potent plant toxin. And as ozone levels go up, the yields from our agricultural crops tend to fall. And then, of course, surprises. Because as we transform all the biophysical conditions that we've evolved to live under, we will continue to experience surprises as they ripple through these complex systems, like the fact that our food has become less nutritious. And of course, I could show you something equally complex for each of the other dimensions of health, and I'm just going to quickly try to give you a feel for what we know about the other dimensions of health and how environmental change is affecting those health outcomes. As you all know, infectious disease exposure is in many ways moderated by environmental conditions. We're coming out of the COVID pandemic, which was from a spillover event, most likely from a raccoon dog population, where a pathogen comes out of a wildlife population and into the human population. We have many other instances of these zoonotic infectious disease episodes, which can lead to pandemics. The SARS pandemic, Nipah virus, Ebola virus, and I could go on. And as we see more and more human incursion into wildlife habitat because of agricultural activities or extractive industries or bushmeat hunting or the wildlife trade, we'll continue to see these spillover events from wildlife into human populations, and the risk of the kinds of pandemics we've been experiencing will go up. But it's not only zoonotic infectious diseases. The most common infectious diseases in the world, things like malaria and schistosomiasis, are vector-borne, and they're exquisitely sensitive to changes in biophysical conditions, so that deforestation is driving malaria. Building dams in West Africa is significantly increasing exposure to schistosomiasis. The extreme weather events that we're seeing, like the flooding in Pakistan, has led to outbreaks of waterborne disease like cholera. And we now know that as we remove species from ecological systems, that something strange happens where less biodiversity leads to greater infectious disease exposure, and that's called the dilution effect. And it's been shown, not in every case, but in most cases, that the loss of biodiversity also increases exposure to infectious diseases. The non-communicable diseases are also being impacted. A couple of years ago, the Global Pollution and Health Report was published in The Lancet and showed that we're seeing about 9 million deaths every year from pollution of air, water, and soil. A large chunk of mortality from diseases like heart disease and lung disease is being caused by pollution. But maybe less intuitive is what I told you earlier, that losing our pollinating insects is actually increasing mortality from non-communicable diseases. And I also worry that this global substitution of dietary carbohydrate for dietary protein, as CO2 goes up and as we get less protein in our food supply and more carbohydrate, we know experimentally that when we do that with human populations in studies like the OmniHeart trial, that it increases heart disease risk. Now that's at higher levels, but we're now doing that experiment with a global population. Mental health is another area that's being significantly impacted by environmental change, and we're all aware that these very extreme episodes that we've been seeing, the extraordinary flooding, the fires, the hurricane seasons that we see in the Caribbean, are associated with intense mental health burdens: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality, joblessness. We also know that those effects are durable, that if you go back 15 years later and talk to people who were affected by Hurricane Katrina, for example, that you still see mental health effects from those episodes. But now what we're starting to learn is that around the world, particularly in young people, we're seeing higher rates of mental health problems from what's being called eco-anxiety or ecological grief. That just knowing that our collective activities are changing our cherished natural systems has become a cause of anxiety and depression. And in particular populations, especially indigenous populations in the far north or populations in low-lying Pacific Island countries, entire cultures and ways of life are being threatened, and we're seeing very large mental health burdens in those populations. And then finally, as we change the biophysical conditions on the planet, we're seeing more and more population displacement. In fact, every year of the last 10 years has set a record for the number of displaced people in the world, and that number has doubled over the last 10 years. Last year, we saw flooding that affected a third of the entire country of Pakistan, displacing 33 million people. And we're seeing more and more of these events. And as these people are forced to move because of flooding or because of the kinds of crop failures we're seeing in the Horn of Africa right now, they often have to move into places where they're not welcome. And that can set up conflict. And this combination of displacement and conflict obviously has very dire health outcomes. It has to be said that all of the kinds of health effects that I'm talking about have a central theme that runs through them of equity and justice. There's something profoundly unfair about the fact that it's the wealthiest people in the world who are benefiting from the activities that transform our natural systems and who are most responsible for transforming those systems, while it's the poorest people in the world, people of color, indigenous peoples, and future generations who are going to bear most of the burden of degraded life support systems. So this is where we find ourselves. The way we are living collectively is placing unsustainable burdens on the life support systems that we depend on. The health of billions of people is being affected. Our house is on fire, and we, as general medical practitioners, must sound the alarm. If our diagnosis is that the size of our ecological footprint has expanded beyond our planet's capacities, then our treatment has to be to advocate for ways to shrink that footprint in order to restore and regenerate our life support systems. The good news is that when we look out at what's possible from here, we see an extraordinarily rich landscape of solutions. There is an enormous amount that we can do across every dimension of human society to achieve that reduction in our total ecological footprint. There is no reason why our grandchildren can't live in a world where human population growth has stabilized and begun to fall as a simple fact of the demographic transition, of educating girls and providing economic opportunities for women, where we have transitioned to a post-combustion energy economy to stabilize our climate system, where we're finding massive efficiencies in how we produce food and manufactured goods with much lower ecological inputs, and where we're designing our cities to optimize human health, mental, physical, cultural health, while minimizing the ecological footprint of the citizens in those cities. It's going to take enlightened policy, and we're seeing a lot of that policy actually in the EU with the European Green New Deal. It's going to take the private sector leading the way and becoming an engine for this great transition and new ways to produce the things that we need. It's going to take movement building and building power among citizens to hold governments and industries accountable, to make sure that we're having the course correction that we need. Universities need to think about knowledge generation and mobilization in different ways. How do we break down the silos that we live in and work across disciplines to address the real problems that our society is facing? And I think we need to acknowledge that underneath the ecological crisis that we're facing, and underneath the global health crisis that it is precipitating, there may also be a spiritual or emotional crisis, that something is broken in our relationship with nature and with each other. And we need new stories drawn from many different places that emphasize that interconnectedness between us and the natural world, and between us and each other through future generations. So what does this mean for all of you? I would argue that we, as general practitioners, are in a privileged position and carry a special responsibility. We're watching humanity sleepwalking toward the edge of a cliff. Most scientific reports make it clear that we have very little time to change course. We, in this room, carry an urgent message that we can no longer do our jobs, that we can no longer safeguard human health into the future, while the natural life support systems that we all depend on are crumbling under the weight of our own ecological footprint. I believe that really understanding and coming to grips with this moment as general practitioners requires an expansion of how we even define ourselves, of what it means to be a general practitioner. Recently, we published a paper about our Clinicians for Planetary Health program in the Planetary Health Alliance, and we looked at concrete ways that clinicians can become involved in planetary health. One is to recognize changing patterns of disease. We're seeing Mesoamerican nephropathy among workers that are forced to work in hotter and hotter conditions. We're seeing changes in where infectious diseases are presenting themselves. We need to call out what we're seeing and play a surveillance role for society to bring it to people's attention. We can be greening our practices as part of walking the walk, whether it's clinics or hospitals, and making sure they're consistent with the principles of planetary health. We have an enormously important role as trusted messengers. Around the world, nurses are the most trusted messengers in the world, and doctors are right behind them. And we touch almost everybody on the planet. We need to carry this message that there are things that people can do for their own personal health, like plant-based diets and active transport, bringing communities to change energy sources to clean air, that are good for their health, but also good for planetary health. We also have a potential role to play in movement building and collective action in bringing communities together to demand the kind of change we need to have a livable future. And of course, we have a critical role in educating the next generation so that every health practitioner in the world understands that there can be no public health without planetary health. Many of you in this room have been involved in an extraordinary effort with the Alliance Santé Planétaire, Denis and Eva among them. And I just want to call that out for all of you so you're aware of the organization and aware that there are already ways to get involved here in France. We also just had the first major convening of a new European hub, which is now going to have a secretariat in the Netherlands, but is cutting across over 80 or 90 organizations across Europe, and already has working groups in education, research, policy, and practice. And there are many ways to get involved with the European hub as well as with the Alliance Santé Planétaire. And Denis and others have led amazing work in translating a book on planetary health into French, which I believe is going to be available after this talk if anyone is interested in taking a look. So I invite all of you to join the Planetary Health Alliance as individuals or organizations, to get our monthly newsletter, to become engaged in our community, to go to the next Planetary Health annual meeting in Malaysia, and to become generally engaged with the field. And with that, I want to close and invite you to join the global community of health practitioners who are coming together to try to safeguard a livable future for humanity and for the rest of life on Earth. Thank you.